Hello, students, and welcome to Introductory to Social Science Research. We are on Module 1, and we are going to be basically focusing on describing aspects of social science research and why research matters for our everyday lives, which it really does. And I'm excited to go through this course with you. You'll usually see this format. I'll probably say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on when you're watching this. But let's dive into the slide, shall we? So why does social science research matter? And this becomes something that becomes really important to talk about because people will say that we aren't real science or soft science, and that's not true. But first, we need to understand what it is and what is social science research. Well, social science research is the process of studying human behavior, relationships, and society. Social science researchers are interested in understanding why people act the way they do, how our behaviors impact our relationships, and how our relationships impact our behaviors, and how our relationships also impact those behaviors. It's a lot of stuff, right? As well as how society plays a role in how we develop and the decisions we make. Social science research can encompass a wide variety of fields, including education, health, sociology, law, human development, anthropology, and many others. Social science research impacts many different career paths to the point where research impacts all of our lives every day, even if you don't realize it. And so as we go through this course and as we dive in a little bit deeper, you're going to be able to see that all these different things are so important and so meshed together. So the goal of this module that we're in right now is to teach you the basics of research and explain why research matters in your everyday life. So first, we're going to focus on learning about research briefly, and this will include a dive into learning how research matters in the way different social sciences careers, including all the ones listed on the slide that you're looking at, which can be education, public health, mental health, social services, family law. These things very much blend into what you're able to do, but they're not it, right? I came from a market research background in the corporate world of America, and I was able to use social science to be able to get a leg up and become a director before I was 30 because it's so enmeshed into everything that we're looking at. And more on that as the class goes on. So let's look at what the purpose of this research is, shall we? So there are three definitive categories that we're going to look at, which are the idea of exploratory, descriptive, as well as explanatory. But the goal of this module, like I said, is to kind of give you eye-opening, not go as deep. So research can be conducted using many different types of methodological approaches. But for this course, as mentioned, we're going to focus on gaining a basic understanding of research rather than learning all about the specific typologies and types of research methods. So generally, research is conducted for the three main purposes. The first purpose, as mentioned, is exploratory. The goal of exploratory research is to explore, as the name says, a specific phenomenon that has now been previously or has not been previously studied in depth. This research is exploratory because not much is known about this topic, and the researcher, much like the explorer, is navigating and searching for new information, right? They're trying to find something out. An example of this is Mary Ainsworth, right? Strange situation study would be an example of how we can utilize and understand and see it in greater life the exploratory research method. This research suggests that attachment to one's caregiver did exist. There was some work on it, but there was little research on the nature of attachment behaviors in infants or their style of attachment, which is where you start seeing the ability to dive into certain areas that interest you with research questions, as we'll discuss. Ainsworth devised an experiment where infants were introduced to a stranger and then to their parent. And researchers took notes on how the infant reacted. Some infants were distressed in the presence of a stranger, but were happy when their mother returned. And these infants became classified as something maybe you've heard called secure attachments. Other infants showed intense distress with the stranger, but when the mother returned, they were resistant on contact, and the infants were known as, surprise, surprise, resistant attachment. Lastly, some infants showed no signs of distress around the stranger and were disinterested in the mother when she returned. And these infants became known as having an avoidant or avoided attachment style. So as you can see, this research is exploratory because it took a previously understood or understudied phenomenon and explored it so that we could better understand attachments. And there's been more since there. If you happen to find yourself in a family human development course, they'll go over all the new categories, and it's a great thing. But another purpose for research that we can look into, other than explanatory, is descriptive. Descriptive research focuses on describing specific phenomenon. An example of descriptive research is the census. The census, which you maybe have done yet at your age, you might not have, right? The census collects basic information known as demographics about people, like the number of people that are living within a household and information about their race, ethnicity, and gender, but also things like their economic structure, right? What quintile are they in? How much do they bring home a year? These kind of descriptive statistics provide us demographic data that allows us to be able to quantify earnings, incomes, see if there's inflation, as you hear all the time in the news, or if we're headed towards a recession. This is what we mean. So within this type of data, the goal is to describe. For example, we can describe how many people live in Maricopa County, right? And what percentage of people living within that certain area, we can go by race or ethnicity, see if there's homogeneous or heterogeneous. We can also look at the income distribution areas to see if there's more need for resources to certain areas than others, right? So we're describing people who live in certain areas with this type of data, but we're not learning about how certain phenomena occur, right? That's where we go into explanatory research. This seeks to explain how phenomena occur, not just be able to study specific ones. And this is the last main purpose of research. Explanatory research looks at the cause-effect relationship between variables. An example of this type of research is when an experiment is conducted in which there is an experimental group and a control group, right? Medical researchers, you constantly maybe have seen on news people saying, hey, we need somebody to come be a part of a new pharmaceutical drug trial. This is where you would see it. So explanatory research use these experimental groups and control groups. Medical research use this type of research when they examine the effectiveness of certain drugs. The experimental group may receive the medication, right? While the control group receives what's known as a placebo. Some people call them a sugar pill, right? It's a pill that is not part of the medicinal purpose, and they can use that to have control over their responses, right? The two groups are compared to see if the experimental group experienced significant change in the health outcome of what they were investigating, while the control group did not. That would be the ideal situation, right? If that occurs, the researchers could conclude that the medication caused changes in the experimental group positively or negatively. And that's also what's so important about when we look for data-rich research. One thing to mention here, right, is also how important it is that we have a large data set that is looking, as we've talked about in these three areas of exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory, that they are being properly sourced, right? You may or may not have heard, but when we had the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, there was an underrepresentation of women, looking at the gender of how we understood this. And that meant we've seen recent research showing that the COVID-19 vaccine actually had a lot of negative impacts to menstruation, birthing issues, stuff that had not been thought of because they had only really sampled a higher concentration of men. This is why it's important that we do research, especially medically. So let's look at some research terms, shall we? We have research question, hypothesis, independent variable, and dependent variable, right? When it comes to research, there are some key terms that I just mentioned, and the first one is that of a research question. A research question is the question a person has about the specific phenomenon. Developing a research question is the first step to doing research. Research question is what guides the type of study that is done. An example of research question is, does the birth order affect personality traits among siblings, for example? Another important research term is that of a hypothesis. A hypothesis is the researcher's prediction or expectation of what the answer to the question will be. Hypotheses are typically grounded or guided by our observations on the world and past research that we maybe have, secondary research. An example of a hypothesis for our research question could be, we hypothesize that the firstborn sibling will be more assertive and display leadership qualities, while the youngest child will be more shy and potentially more introverted. I don't know if I agree with this. Being the youngest child, that's not how my siblings work, but still. When conducting research, we have different types of variables, including independent variables and dependent variables. Independent variables are the variables that the experimenter manipulates or looks at different levels of. In the example that we just gave, I think example study, we talked about on the last slide, the type of medication would be the independent variable. And because some participants received the actual medication and others received that placebo, right? For our current research question, the independent variable would be the birth order, because we've looked at how birth order impacts another variable. Dependent variables are the outcome variables that researchers measure. So researchers look at how dependent variables change at different levels of the independent variable, right? So how does that impact that dependent variable, that independent variable? For the experimental study, health outcomes like blood pressure or cholesterol might be the dependent variable, as the researchers look at how particular health changes as a result of having medication or if they had the placebo, right? For our sibling study, the dependent variable is personality traits. Researchers would measure participants' personality traits and see how personality traits are different from the firstborn v. the youngest child. So it becomes important to understand these. So let's discuss the idea of the scientific method, right? The way that we use positivistic science to be able to approach to be able to use this in data, not just having hypotheses or theorizing, right? We're making sure we're testing this, that it can be repeatable and that it's not a one-off, right? So is it generalizable? Understanding the scientific method is crucial to understanding how research is done, period. Mess around and find out is a famous joke of another way to say these steps. The scientific method always starts with an observation and causes you to generate a research question, an RQ, right? With our previous example about birth order personality, you may have observed that many firstborn children displayed similar personality characteristics. And that led you to develop the research question, does birth order affect personality traits? The next step in the scientific method requires you to do some research to see what is already known about this topic, right? You don't want to reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. Having this information helps you complete the next step of the scientific method, which is to generate a hypothesis. Based on past research, you might hypothesize that firstborn siblings will be more assertive and display more leadership qualities, while the youngest child may be more shy or introverted, which was originally the thought we said. Next, you will take that hypothesis and test it by conducting an experiment, something that we can do here to be able to try to prove our theory, right? Our hypothesis, our question. To do this, we may survey using things like Qualtrics a lot of siblings and ask them to report their birth order and provide them with a questionnaire through something like Qualtrics that assesses their personality traits. We can then collect all our data. We could analyze the data, meaning that we would take the information from the survey and use statistical analysis to see if the firstborn siblings shared similar personality traits with other firstborn siblings, and if the youngest sibling shared similar personality traits with the other youngest siblings. Lastly, we would report the results of our studies so that other people know about the research. The scientific method of research is cyclical, right? Meaning that conducting research often causes us to think more about questions or more ideas, which in turn leads to more hypotheses, experiments, and data analysis. From there, we look at more importance of research, right? In addition to understanding the basics of research process, it's important to know that research plays an integral part in our everyday lives. Truly, it's everywhere. Every career field either directly works with research or indirectly impacted by research. In education, research plays a role in determining if they should make changes to curriculum. What are the best practices for working with students with learning disabilities or learning differences? And what types of intervention programs are offered to students in schools, right? Programs like SAILS here at ASU. Then the intervention program may be offered to students who are struggling with the specific topics, or the overall instructional approach to teaching specific topics may be changed if the majority of students are struggling with said topic. Now, this type of research allows people to be informed that health decisions that they make. Research also plays a role in mental health fields, like if you're a psychology major. For example, the DSM is a manual that lists different types of mental health conditions and their criteria for the diagnosis. This manual was compiled based on research and is periodically updated, right, based on the norms, attitudes, behaviors, and conditions of society. Things shift. Mental health professionals use this manual to make a diagnosis for their clients, right? Additionally, research helps inform what treatment approach may be best for different conditions. An example of this, right, is that in the early 2000s until about the mid 2000s, right, it used to be observed that children could not suffer from mood disorders like bipolar. And so the differences between males and females who were diagnosed with this or showed signs of this, you weren't allowed to diagnose teenagers. And so men who have earlier onset were actually diagnosed as ADHD because of what the DSM said, and were given a lot of stimulants, which is normal for ADHD, but is not okay for someone who deals with manic episodes. So later the DSM changed that teenagers could be able to be diagnosed, and a lot of people's impacts by this were adjusted and helped. So we change as times change, right, as the research becomes available. Some of the social service programs that have been developed based on research include TAMP, right? TAMP, which provides temporary assistance to families in need, including money for food, clothing, and living expenses, You may have heard people say SNAP benefits. SNAP is another program that was created to help families experiencing food insecurities. Research was used to determine when families might need assistance, what type of assistance would benefit families most, and how much assistance to offer, which is always up for conversation, right? Some of these programs, most of them actually don't offer help with things like diapers, and that's something that's being looked into with things like diaper banks that do provide this, a resource that realized that these benefits don't offer something that is so expensive and critical for a new parent, a young parent, right? Or any parent, really. Another issue that they look at, like things like the idea of food diaper banks, is what about those who are not children? How do we provide resources for those who are aging, elderly in our community? So, something to consider. A really cool, interesting thing to think about, both positive and negatively. Prior to the late 90s, it was actually only a primary care physician or a PCP that could be able to report a child abuse. And once that shifted towards mandatory reporters like myself and people who are in so many different positions, but especially here in the academic, your professors, your teachers, your graduate TAs, your TAs are what's called a mandatory reporter. They allowed people from different backgrounds, not just PCPs or primary care physicians, to report abuse. And in that late 90s, childhood abuse rates went up by 300%. And that sounds good and scary at the same time. However, one thing to note is that we didn't have the social support structure to be able to maintain that kind of increase. Max Weber, who you'll likely have read about, talked about the ideal versus the real. The ideal world would have none of this. The real world allows us to build for it. Unfortunately, with that kind of increase, we saw an influx of underreporting or not having substantiations towards these, but it was a change for the better. So social science research also plays a role in family law, which I was just alluding to. Policymakers used evidence-based research to make policies that impact families and children, and research is also used when making legal decisions regarding families on topics such as parental custody or in foster care. My research, if you're curious, actually looks into trying to evaluate how we could add more policy and research from the social sciences to use the importance of research to combat the current industry known as the congregate care, the troubled teen industry, because they find loopholes within policy because there's a lack of research. So it's so important that there is research so that we can use that to avoid abusive situations or care that's not necessarily positive. So there's so much to look at when we look at the importance of research. Even if your job isn't directly involved, like I've been talking about very specified fields, is most likely impacted by research in some way. For example, if you've worked in food services at a restaurant, right, research likely has played a role in your job by impacting the types of food you sell to customers. Right, food companies do market research at companies like I used to work for to learn about what their customers are interested in and target their products towards customers' interests, which, by the way, goes a lot of different directions. And I'll tell you some stories as we go through this course. But an example of this is, think of things like Taco Bell. They brought back the Mexican pizza. This was based upon users really requesting it, so much so that once they brought it back, the store started running out of ingredients. Or look at McDonald's, also uses research when they made the decision about when and how they bring back the McRib to being a seasonal item. There are people through socio-religious institutions that only eat the McRib during certain periods of Catholic observation, and this becomes important to them because it's something that they can eat, they enjoy, and it ties into periods of their religious institution. So being able to market this based on seasonality and also people's buying trends allows for higher product and ROI. One cool thing that, if you didn't know, there's a bunch of videos on this on social media if you want to look it up, but a cool story for you. There's a reason there's such a correlation between soda being sold at fast food restaurants, is that the fattiness of fast food actually sticks to our teeth. And then that feeling psychologically triggers our brain that we're full. Water wouldn't really get rid of it that well, but soda is so high in acidity that it actually cleans our teeth in a way that allows us not to have that mental trigger or stimuli that would tell us that we're full. So them offering sodas in their meals actually increases our consumption, and the varying ability of the type of flavors that they have also keeps us a little bit away from getting sick of the food, because if we have too many things consistently, our brain kind of gets dull of it. So there is a lot of science in food science, and it's very interesting. Same thing with when you go into stores. How you turn and how things are productly placed is thought through by companies. Which way you turn right or left is not a choice you make. It's actually usually made for you because of how our brain gets used to patterns. Think about if you've been to a store and you turned left instead of right, or turned right instead of left, and you had turned right or left on a usual basis. You're going to be weirded out from the minute you do that. Something that simple, right? So if you've ever worked in retail, it is also likely that research has had an impact on your job. Companies conduct research to see what types of clothing items are trending, on purchase items to sell accordingly based on that research, as we're seeing a resurgence of millennial fashion, right? It already came back in, so stores know to kind of point it out there. You may have seen the funny social media videos of people around my age, I'm 38, being like, oh, I'm back in high school because it has resurfaced. And they need to know these things. Retail stores also do research when it comes to marketing. They want to know the best market how to best market the clothes they're selling in the stores so people purchase their items, right? You don't want to just have things that are out of touch. Research also impacts any jobs where people work in the office. Companies use research from industrial and organizational psychologists as well as sociologists to understand how to promote a positivistic or positive work environment and job satisfaction. Hawthorne's effect is one of the major things that has been done in the past. It was done in my hometown in Illinois, my home state. They brought in somebody to adjust the lights, which do impact productivity if you didn't know. But what happened is they realized that when people are being observed, they work harder. They hold to a certain impression management because they think they're being watched. But when people left after installing the lights, productivity returned to normal. So the idea of that floor manager annoying you if you've ever been in a job with one isn't just because they want to annoy you. It kind of is, but it does increase your productivity. They use research to inform how the office environment is designed, how they should be training employees, how teams of employees should be structured, how to promote motivation in the workplace, and many other topics related to this office type of jobs. So odds are that even if you work in an office environment in corporate America, some aspects of your job have been impacted by research, period. Even if you have a job that might seem unobviously related to research, if you take a deeper look, it's most likely that you're seeing research and now you're going to start noticing it, that glass shattering effect. After this, you're going to start asking the questions. And that's what C. Rhett Mills calls the sociological imagination. And due to this, you can see how much of the impact research has on our daily life, as it touches most, if not all, aspects of our lives. So I'm super excited to have you in this class. This brings us to a conclusion of the first lecture, and I will see you in the next one.